Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Story Relaxing. Tonight we are standing in half-frozen soil breath, fogging in the air, hands numb as iron tools bite into earth that does not want to open. The ground smells sharp and mineral, a cold scent that feels older than memory. Snow waits nearby like a patient witness. You can already imagine the relief of being below all that wind, tucked under something solid and unmoving. You probably won't survive this, at least not in the way comfort is usually imagined. Survival here is quieter, slower, and far less cinematic. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you are listening late, tell me where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, and you keep digging. Winter is not fully settled yet, but it is close enough to feel. You know this because the soil has already hardened near the surface. Each shovel stroke lands with a dull resistance, not the soft crumble you hoped for. Going underground is not a romantic decision. It is a calculation made with sore shoulders and empty pockets. On the frontier, timber can be scarce nails, expensive, and time painfully short. One widely accepted historical reality is that many settlers on the Great Plains turned to dugouts and sod houses because trees were rare, and hauling lumber across open grassland could cost more than the land itself. Earth, on the other hand, is everywhere. It does not need to be purchased. It only needs to be persuaded. You work methodically. The hole deepens just enough for the wind to soften around you. Already the air feels different, quieter. There is less movement, less bite. That is the first lesson the ground offers. Cold travels fast above ground, racing across skin and fabric. Below it slows down almost reluctantly. Soil acts like a thick blanket. It holds yesterday's warmth and releases it slowly. A fact many settlers learn through experience rather than textbooks. The earth is not warm exactly. It is steady. And steadiness matters more than heat when winter stretches on without mercy. As you dig, do you notice how sound changes? Your shovel strike echoes less. The open sky no longer throws noise back at you. This muffling effect is part of what makes underground living so unsettling at first. People often imagine frontier life as loud and exposed, full of wind, howling through cracks. Underground, the danger feels closer but quieter. Some historians still debate whether early dugouts were meant as temporary shelters or whether many families intended to live in them longer, but were simply overtaken by events. Diaries suggest both interpretations existed at the same time, depending on luck weather and whether spring arrived kindly or not. You pause to stretch your fingers. They ache. Dirt works its way into the seams of your gloves. There is no clean boundary between you and the ground anymore. This is not something that happens when you build upward. It happens when you build inward. Your clothes darken with soil, and you accept that they will never fully recover. That acceptance is important. Underground living demands it early. One quirky detail from frontier accounts is that some settlers reportedly preferred the smell of earth to the constant smoke of poorly vented cabins. To them, damp soil felt honest. Smoke felt like failure. The shape of the space begins to matter now. You're not carving a grand room, you're shaping survival. Walls must slope slightly to avoid collapse. Corners are softened, not squared, because sharp angles invite stress fractures and frozen ground. There is no blueprint in your hands. The plan exists in your head, assembled from neighbourly advice, observation and rumour. Someone told you last winter that a dugout should face south if possible, to steal whatever sunlight dares to show itself. Someone else swore that east-facing entrances drifted shut less often. Frontier knowledge travels this way, imperfect and urgent. As the pit grows deeper, the wind becomes a distant problem. You still hear it, but it no longer touches your skin the same way. That change brings relief and unease at the same time. You're trading one set of dangers for another. Above ground you can run. Below ground, you must trust what you have built. scholars continue to question how much settlers truly understood soil stability versus how much they relied on luck and constant repair. The truth likely sits somewhere uncomfortable in between. You imagine the roof already, even though it is not there yet. Logs' branches sod anything heavy enough to hold warmth and light enough not to crush you. Weight is both friend and threat. The earth presses down, but that pressure is what keeps the cold out. You learn quickly that underground life is defined by compromise. Every advantage comes paired with a risk that must be watched daily. There is a moment when the hole feels like a room for the first time, not comfortable, not finished, but enclosed enough to suggest shelter. The temperature inside is noticeably different now. Your breath still shows, but it does not vanish as quickly. The ground radiates yesterday's stored warmth in a way that feels almost kind. This is why people chose this life. Not because it was easy, but because it worked often enough to be worth trying. You climb out briefly, looking back down into what will soon be home. From above it looks fragile. From below it will feel solid. That contradiction will follow you through the winter. Underground living reshapes perception. Safety becomes something you feel rather than see. Darkness becomes a tool instead of an enemy. And as you shovel again, you realize that winter has already begun to lose a small argument here. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, one scoop of earth at a time. You lower yourself down into the space again as evening settles without asking permission. The sky above fades from pale to steel grey, but you notice it only briefly. Down here, light behaves differently, it does not linger. It simply stops arriving. The first night underground does not announce itself with ceremony. It arrives the way cold does gradually, until you realise it has taken full possession. You arrange yourself carefully. The ground is uneven, still raw from digging, and your body feels every ridge and hollow. There is no proper bed yet. Maybe a thin layer of straw, maybe a folded blanket already stiff from previous nights of frost. You lie back anyway because rest is not optional. Fatigue presses harder than discomfort. The ceiling feels close even though it is technically higher than your outstretched arms. Weight is implied rather than seen. The earth above you is quiet, but it is very present. Sound changes first. Above ground night carries noise far, wind skims across open land. Animals announce themselves, wood creaks and snaps. Underground everything feels muted, as if wrapped in thick fabric. You hear your own breathing more clearly than anything else. Each inhale sounds louder than expected. Each exhale settles slowly instead of dispersing. This stillness is unsettling at first. People accustomed to cabins often wrote that the silence below ground felt heavier than storms. Some historians still argue whether this silence contributed to anxiety or whether settlers eventually found it calming. Journals suggest both reactions could happen in the same person sometimes on the same night. The smell is different too. Earth has a scent that is hard to describe without calling it clean and damp at the same time. It carries hints of roots, minerals, and cold moisture. There is no sharp tang of fresh-cut wood here, no resin, no smoke yet. The air feels thick, not stale exactly, but contained. You become aware that every breath you take will stay with you longer than it would above ground. Ventilation is tomorrow's problem. Tonight you focus on warmth and rest. Your body slowly releases the day's tension. Muscles ache in waves, each one announcing itself before easing slightly. The ground beneath you is firm but not icy. This surprises you. One commonly accepted historical observation is that soil temperatures a few feet below the surface remain far more stable than air temperatures even during extreme cold snaps. Settlers did not calculate this in degrees, they felt it in their bones. The earth does not radiate warmth like a fire, but it refuses to steal heat as quickly as winter air does. You shift trying to find a position that wastes as little warmth as possible. Curling slightly helps, so does keeping your elbows tucked in. Underground sleep teaches efficiency. There is no room for sprawling. That closeness can feel intrusive at first. Yet many frontier accounts mention that people slept more soundly underground once they stopped fighting the posture it required. Rest here is not about luxury, it is about conservation. Darkness settles fully now, the kind of darkness that does not fade when you blink. If there is a lamp, it burns low, its light swallowed quickly by packed earth walls. Shadows do not stretch far. They cling close, barely forming shapes before dissolving again. You realize how much you rely on light to define space. Without it, the room feels both smaller and infinite. Some scholars continue to debate whether prolonged low-light environments affected settlers' sense of time and mood. What is certain is that many described nights underground as longer even when clocks said otherwise. A small sound makes you tense. Dirt settling. Not collapsing, just adjusting. The earth shifts as temperatures change and you feel it rather than hear it. This is one of those moments that test your resolve. You remind yourself that this is normal, that soil expands and contracts, that the ceiling holds. Still, your body does not fully relax until the sound fades into nothing. You think briefly of cabins, of walls you can knock on, of windows that show stars even when they let cold pour in. Underground living removes that visual reassurance. You cannot see what protects you. You can only trust it. One quirky detail from personal letters is that some settlers slept better underground during blizzards, specifically because they could not see the storm. Fear loses some power when it has no shape. Your breathing evens out slowly. The earth absorbs sound and movement, encouraging stillness. It becomes clear that this space wants quiet. Loud thoughts feel out of place here. Worries about tomorrow's work soften. There is digging left to do, roof to finish, fire to manage. But those tasks belong to daylight, however faint that daylight may be in winter. Tonight is about learning the rhythm of this place. You notice the temperature again. It has not dropped the way it would above ground. The cold feels paused, held at bay by sheer mass. This steadiness is the true promise of underground life. Not comfort exactly, but predictability. Cold will come, but it will come slowly. That difference can mean survival. As sleep approaches, the ceiling no longer feels threatening. It feels protective, like a heavy quilt pressed down evenly. The silence stops being loud. Your body accepts the rules of this place. Underground night is not something to endure with clenched teeth. It is something you sink into, carefully trusting the earth to hold while you let go. You wake without a clear signal that morning has arrived. There is no brightening window, no birdsong filtering through cracks. Instead, consciousness returns the way warmth does here, slowly, and without drama. Your body notices first. Fingers feel less stiff than expected. Breath does not burn your throat. The cold is present, but it is not sharpened overnight. That realization settles in gently. The earth has done its quiet work. You sit up and press your palm against the wall. It feels cool but not punishing. The temperature is steady in a way that would feel impossible in a tent or a thin-walled cabin. One well-established historical observation is that soil acts as thermal mass, absorbing heat during warmer periods and releasing it when temperatures drop. Frontier settlers rarely used that language, but they understood the effect intuitively. They knew that once underground, the night cold arrived late and left early. That alone could decide whether a family lasted the winter. You stretch carefully, mindful of the low ceiling. Movements here are smaller by necessity. Even standing becomes a measured act. You light a small flame, not for heat yet, but for reassurance. The glow reveals walls darkened by moisture and fingerprints. The light seems to rest against the earth instead of bouncing away. Heat behaves similarly. It lingers. It does not rush off at the first opportunity. As you warm your hands, you think about how strange it is that the ground which freezes solid on the surface can remain relatively calm just a few feet down. Snow above actually helps. A thick snowpack insulates the soil, trapping warmth underneath. Settlers noticed this long before scientists described it. There are accounts of people deliberately piling snow against dugout entrances for added insulation, even though it meant more work clearing exits later. That choice speaks volumes about priorities in winter. Cold was the enemy, extra labour was acceptable. You notice condensation forming near the flame. Moisture beads on the wall, catching light briefly before sliding down. Heat brings this side effect. Warm air meets cool earth and leaves traces behind. Managing moisture becomes part of daily life underground. Too much heat too quickly invites dampness. Too little invites cold. Balance matters more here than anywhere else. There is a subtle comfort in this predictability. Above ground temperature, swings feel aggressive. Wind strips heat away without warning. Underground changes announce themselves slowly. This gives you time to respond. That time buffer saves energy and nerves alike. Some historians continue to debate whether dugouts truly offered superior comfort, or whether settlers simply adapted psychologically to fewer fluctuations. The evidence suggests both physical and mental adjustments work together. The steadiness mattered because people learned to trust it. You eat something simple. Food tastes different in cool, still air. Smells linger longer. Even chewing sounds louder in the quiet. You realize that underground life sharpens certain senses while dulling others. Sight loses importance. Touch and temperature take over. You pay close attention to how quickly the room warms when the fire burns, and how long that warmth stays after the flame dies down. One quirky detail from letters and memoirs is that some settlers claim their dugouts felt warmer after several weeks of continuous use. Modern readers might dismiss this as imagination, but there is some logic behind it. Repeated heating can slowly raise the average temperature of surrounding soil, especially when insulation improves over time. Whether the effect was significant or simply comforting is still open to interpretation, but the belief itself mattered. Hope is a form of insulation too. You step closer to the wall, again noticing how the temperature barely changes from floor to ceiling. In cabins, heat rises and leaves feet numb. Underground warmth distributes more evenly. That changes how you dress and move. Heavy boots stay on longer. Layers are adjusted less often. The body appreciates consistency, especially when calories are scarce. The fire dies down and you wait. Minutes pass, the air cools slightly, then settles. It does not plunge. This is the earth holding what it has been given. The sensation is subtle but profound. It teaches patience. You learn that not all warmth needs to be immediate to be useful. Slow warmth is reliable warmth. You think about neighbours who chose to stay above ground. Some built sod houses with thick walls and turf roofs trying to mimic this same effect. Others endured thin cabins that whistled all night. Comparing notes became a quiet obsession in winter. Whose shelter stayed warmest? Whose fire lasted longest? Underground dwellers often noted fewer temperature extremes, though they also complained more about dampness and darkness. Every solution carried its own discomforts. As the day progresses, you notice how little the interior temperature reacts to the outside world. A cloud passes overhead, but nothing changes inside. Wind picks up unheard and unfelt. That separation is comforting, but it can also be disorienting. Time feels softer here. Without sharp cues, hours blend. Some scholars have suggested that this temporal blurring contributed to winter lethargy or depression. Others argue it simply encouraged rest during a season when rest was necessary. The truth likely depended on the person and the winter itself. You add a bit more fuel later, careful not to overdo it. Too much heat wastes resources and invites condensation. Underground living teaches restraint. Every action has delayed consequences. Warmth arrives slowly. Moisture accumulates quietly. Problems rarely announce themselves until they are well underway. By evening, the room holds a gentle warmth that feels earned rather than forced. You settle in again, aware that tonight will likely feel much like last night. That repetition is the point. Survival here is not about dramatic victories. It is about maintaining a narrow, stable range of conditions day after day. The earth helps by refusing to rush. It absorbs your efforts and gives them back gradually. As darkness deepens above unnoticed by you, the ground keeps its promise. Cold presses down from the sky, but it stalls before reaching you. You lie back, understanding now why people trusted this method enough to bet their winters on it. The earth does not fight the cold, it outlasts it. And as sleep returns, you do the same. By the time you wake again, the space no longer feels temporary. It feels unfinished, yes, but claimed. That difference matters. You stretch and immediately notice the wall close to your shoulder, the ceiling just above where you would like to stand straight. Underground living teaches awareness through proximity. Every inch counts. Today is about making those inches behave. You gather what materials you have managed to collect. None of them match. A few short logs scavenge from a creek bed. Branches trimmed of their weakest points. Chunks of sod cut from nearby ground, each one heavy and reluctant to lift. There is no elegance to this work. Frontier shelters underground were shaped by availability, not preference. One thing period records agree on is that settlers rarely built dugouts the way they first imagined them. They built them the way supplies allowed. You drag a log into position and wedge it carefully against the earth. It fits badly, but badly is still usable. That is a lesson learned early. Precision is a luxury, stability is the goal. You test the pressure with your weight, listening closely. The earth answers back with silence. That is encouraging. Construction underground feels different from building upward. Gravity is no longer your primary concern, pressure is. The walls are already holding back tons of soil and you are careful not to insult that balance. Instead of forcing materials into straight lines, you let the space dictate shape. Roof supports angle slightly inward. Gaps are filled with sod and packed dirt rather than frustration. This approach shows up again and again in winter accounts. Settlers describe building not as imposing order but as negotiating with the ground. As you work, your hands grow numb, then warm again, cycling slowly. The air inside holds heat just well enough to prevent the sharp bite that steals dexterity. This matters. Fine movements are possible here that would be agony above ground. That small advantage can decide whether a roof is finished before a storm arrives. You pause to rest, leaning against the wall. Moisture darkens the soil where your back touches it. Dampness is unavoidable, but it is manageable if respected. Too much organic material rots. Too little insulation invites cold. The balance shifts daily. People living this way learned quickly that maintenance was not seasonal. It was constant. An overlooked but fascinating detail from dugout descriptions is how often settlers reuse materials from failed structures. A collapsed sod wall from one site might become roofing elsewhere. Broken furniture sometimes reinforced doorways. Nothing went to waste because nothing could afford to. Waste was a surface luxury. Underground, every object earned its continued existence. You think briefly about cabins with square corners and upright walls. They look confident, even defiant, standing against wind and snow. Underground spaces feel the opposite. They do not challenge the environment. They accept it and work around it. That difference shapes the building process. You're not constructing a statement. You're assembling a compromise. There is ongoing disagreement among historians about how much planning went into dugouts versus how much was improvised. Some evidence suggests families sketched layouts and followed shared designs. Other sources indicate that many dugouts evolved room by room as needs changed. The truth seems uneven. Well-supplied settlers planned more. Desperate ones adapted faster. Both survived in their own ways. You lift another sod block and set it into place. It smells like grass and cold earth. The block fits poorly at first, leaving a gap that invites drafts. You press soil into the space with your hands packing it firmly. The gap disappears. Drafts are patient. They find every weakness eventually. Underground living teaches vigilance. Small problems grow quietly. As the roof structure takes shape, the ceiling lowers slightly. The space feels tighter. That could be alarming if you let it be. Instead, you focus on what it means. Less air to heat, less volume to manage. Settlers often noted that dugouts felt oppressive at first, then oddly efficient. There is no unused space here. Everything has a purpose, including the air. A small opening is left intentionally. Not large enough to be called a window, but enough to allow light and air exchange. Its placement matters. Too low and it invites drifting snow. Too high and heat escapes. Accounts vary wildly on best placement, and even today researchers cannot fully agree on which configurations worked best across different regions. Climate, soil type and wind patterns all played a role. What worked in Nebraska might fail in Kansas. You step back and look at your progress. The shelter is still rough, walls uneven, ceiling low, but it holds. That is the standard. Not beauty, not comfort, holding. As evening approaches again, you notice how much quieter it feels inside now that the roof structure is partially complete. Sound dampens further. Wind fades almost entirely. This quiet is not empty. It is dense like padded cloth pressed against your ears. Some settlers later described missing wind sounds when they moved back above ground. Silence once accepted can become familiar. You finish by sealing smaller gaps, knowing you will find more tomorrow. Underground shelters were rarely finished in the way modern homes are finished. They were perpetually becoming. That mindset changes how you judge success. Completion is less important than improvement. You sit down to rest, feeling the space respond to your presence. Heat from your body lingers longer now. The shelter is learning you slowly. You understand why people stayed underground longer than planned. Once built, these spaces reward consistency. Leave them cold too long and dampness creeps in. Occupy them steadily and they stabilize. Night arrives unnoticed again. The roof above you feels heavier now, but also safer. Weight and security blur together. As you lie back sore and tired, you realize that underground life is not defined by clever construction tricks. It is defined by patience, adaptation, and a willingness to accept imperfect solutions. The shelter is not finished, it never will be, but it is enough for tonight. And tonight enough matters more than anything else. Morning arrives again without some spectacle. You sense it only because your body feels rested enough to move. Light has not improved much. In fact, it barely qualifies as light at all. A thin, grey presence seeps through the small opening you left weak and unfocused, as if the sun itself is unsure whether it should bother looking in. This is when you begin to understand how limited light shapes everything underground. You strike a flame and the lamp responds immediately, its glow soft and contained. The walls drink it in. Shadows do not stretch far here. They stay close to the objects that cast them, clinging rather than wandering. Your world becomes a series of near distances. There is no far corner to glance toward. Everything important is within arm's reach. Frontier winter journals consistently note how little natural light entered dugouts, especially once snow piled high around entrances and openings. Even during midday, many families relied on lamps or candles to see clearly. Fuel for light became nearly as important as fuel for heat. Without it, time itself felt slippery. You notice how the dimness slows you down. Movements become deliberate, not because you are cautious, but because rushing serves no purpose when visibility is limited. You learn to reach before stepping, to feel surfaces before trusting them. The body adapts quickly. Sight becomes less dominant. Touch takes over quietly. There is an unexpected benefit to this. With fewer visual distractions, the space feels calmer. Thoughts drift more easily. The flicker of the lamp creates a rhythm that encourages stillness. Some settlers later wrote that underground evenings felt longer, even when measured hours said otherwise. Modern historians still wrestle with whether this perception came from low light levels or simply from winter isolation stretching attention inward. Either way, the effect was real. You sit close to the lamp, hands warming not just from heat, but from brightness. Light feels physical here, something you can almost hold. You position the flame carefully, knowing that too much brightness wastes precious fuel, while too little invites accidents. Balance returns as a theme again. One unusual detail found in a handful of personal accounts is that some families whitened portions of their dugout walls with ash or clay. The goal was not decoration, it was reflection. Lighter surfaces helped spread limited light more effectively, making the room feel larger and safer. Whether this practice was widespread or simply inventive problem-solving remains unclear, but the idea itself speaks to how precious light became. You try working for a while without the lamp just to see. Shapes blur immediately, depth disappears, the space flattens into suggestion rather than certainty. You abandon the experiment quickly. Darkness here is not dramatic, it is simply inconvenient. An inconvenience repeated often enough becomes dangerous. The lamp returns to its place. The room settles again. Smoke rises slowly, lingering longer than it would above ground. You watch it curl against the ceiling before slipping away through small gaps. Ventilation will matter more as winter deepens. For now, you accept the haze as part of the environment. Clothing feels different in this light. Colours lose meaning. Texture becomes more noticeable. You can tell which fabric is worn thin by touch alone. You begin to associate warmth not with brightness but with closeness. Sitting near the lamp, sitting near each other. Light encourages gathering even when no one speaks. Some scholars have questioned whether long periods of dim light affected sleep patterns in underground dwellings. There is evidence that people rested more frequently, taking short naps rather than maintaining strict day and night cycles. Others argue that work demands still dictated routines regardless of lighting. The truth likely varied from household to household. What remains consistent is that light no longer ruled the day, necessity did. As evening approaches, the outside world fades even further from awareness. Snow may be falling, wind may be scouring the land. You do not know unless someone tells you. Underground, the day ends not when the sun sets, but when tasks are finished and energy runs low. You lower the lamp's flame and lie back. The dim glow softens into something almost optional. Darkness presses closer, but it no longer feels threatening. It feels familiar. The earth does not demand brightness. It prefers moderation. Your eyes close easily tonight. The absence of light encourages rest rather than resistance. You realize that underground winters do not just shelter the body. They quiet the senses one by one until only what matters remains. And in this softened darkness, sleep comes without effort. You become aware of the air before you think about it, not because it is bad exactly, but because it feels shared. Underground, nothing truly leaves. Every breath stays a little longer, brushing past you again before slipping away through cracks and openings that are never quite enough. You sit up and inhale slowly. The air is cool and slightly heavy, carrying the faint smells of earth smoke and whatever you last cooked. It is not unpleasant, but it demands attention. One detail repeatedly noted in frontier winter accounts is that ventilation was one of the most persistent concerns in dugouts, often mentioned, more often than cold itself. Fresh air was harder to manage than warmth. You adjust the small opening near the ceiling, clearing loose dirt that has slumped overnight. This simple act changes the room almost immediately. The air shifts. Breathing feels easier. It is a reminder that underground living is interactive. The shelter responds to care and neglect in equal measure. Unlike cabins which leak air, whether you want them to or not, dugouts hold on tightly. That grip is comforting when temperatures plunge, but it becomes a problem when smoke builds up or when too many bodies share the space. Families learned to read the air the way sailors read weather. A headache meant something was wrong. Heavy eyelids meant it was time to adjust the fire or open a vent. There is still debate among researchers about how effective early ventilation methods truly were. Some believe that simple roof holes and door gaps provided enough airflow when combined with careful fire management. Others argue that many settlers likely endured poor air quality for long stretches, accepting discomfort as part of winter survival. Written complaints suggest both experiences existed often within the same season. You light a small fire and watch how the smoke behaves. It curls upward, slowly hesitates, then drifts toward the opening. That is a good sign. You resist the urge to build the fire larger. Underground restraint keeps air breathable. Flames are invited guests, not rulers. The sound of breathing becomes noticeable again. Not just yours, but the room's. The faint pull of air through narrow passages. The quiet settling of smoke. The shelter feels alive in a subdued way. You are not sealed off from the world. You are negotiating with it through layers of soil and wood. One odd habit described in a few diaries involves settlers waving blankets or boards near ceiling vents to encourage airflow during calm weather. The image feels almost comical, but it worked well enough to be remembered. When wind refused to cooperate, people invented it. You begin your day's tasks mindful of how movement stirs the air. Dust rises easily. You keep sweeping gentle, avoiding clouds that linger longer than expected. Underground dust does not disappear quickly. It hangs, reminding you that gravity works differently when air barely moves. As the day warms slightly outside, you feel the difference inside only faintly. Temperature changes arrive muted, but air quality shifts more noticeably. You crack the door briefly, letting fresh cold air slide in. It feels sharp and clean, and you understand why people risked losing heat just to breathe freely for a few minutes. Some historians continue to question whether underground shelters contributed to respiratory issues over long winters. Evidence is incomplete. Medical records from the frontier are sparse and inconsistent. What is clear is that settlers were aware of the risks. They talked about bad air. They adjusted routines. Awareness did not eliminate danger, but it reduced it. By afternoon, the air settles into a workable balance. You close openings, partially trusting the slow exchange to continue. The space feels calmer. Your breathing deepens without effort. This equilibrium feels earned. As night approaches again, you lower the fire and listen. The room exhales softly. Smoke thins. The air cools slightly, then steadies. Underground life rewards attention to invisible details. Air cannot be seen, but it can be felt, and it will not tolerate neglect. You lie back, breathing slowly, appreciating this fragile comfort. Warmth keeps you alive. Air lets you rest. And here beneath the ground, both depend on patience rather than force. Night settles, and you begin to understand where bodies belong when space runs short. There is no debate about comfort here. There is only efficiency. You lay things out in the way that wastes the least warmth and effort. Bedding is thin, often shared, and placed where the ceiling slopes lowest. Warm air does not rise far in a dugout, but it still drifts upward just enough to matter. You arrange yourself close to the wall, knees slightly bent, shoulders angled so you do not brush the roof when you shift. Every movement is learned through small corrections. Over time, your body remembers these limits without thinking. This is how people slept winter after winter without complaint. Not because it was pleasant, but because it became familiar. Accounts from frontier families show that sleeping arrangements underground rarely followed modern ideas of privacy. Parents, children, and sometimes extended relatives shared the same narrow space. Mattresses were improvised from straw corn husks or old clothing sewn together. What mattered was insulation, not softness. Cold punished separation. Closeness conserved heat. You notice how breathing synchronizes when people sleep nearby. The room feels fuller, warmer, more alive. Heat is not only something you create with fire, it is something bodies share quietly through proximity. This is one reason underground shelters often felt warmer at night than during the day. The space worked best when occupied. There is a lingering question among researchers about whether crowding in dugouts was a deliberate design choice or simply unavoidable. Some believe builders intentionally kept sleeping areas tight to retain warmth. Others suggest families adapted sleeping patterns after construction revealed how much space could be heated effectively. The truth likely shifted from household to household, shaped by trial rather than theory. You pull a blanket higher and notice how little air moves near the floor. Drafts are rare here. That stillness allows even thin coverings to work better than expected. You begin to appreciate why underground sleeping felt less brutal than surface living, even with fewer materials. Cold attacks from movement as much as temperature. Remove movement and cold loses one of its weapons. A curious detail appears in a few winter recollections. Some families slept with their heads toward the door during severe storms, believing it made breathing easier if smoke or bad air built up overnight. Whether this actually helped is uncertain, but the practice itself shows how seriously people thought about air and survival while sleeping. You listen to the sounds that accompany rest underground. Breathing, a shift of fabric, the faint settling of earth. These noises replace the howl of wind and the snap of frozen wood. They are closer, more intimate. For some, this closeness felt reassuring. For others, it pressed on the nerves. Reactions varied and journals reflect that tension without resolving it. The ceiling feels nearest now when you are lying down. Darkness blurs its exact distance, but you are always aware of it. This awareness does not fade completely. It becomes background knowledge like the weight of a heavy quilt. You stop testing it with your eyes. You trust it or you do not sleep. Children adapt fastest. They curl easily into small spaces, bodies warm and flexible. Adults require more time. Stiff joints argue. Old injuries complain. Still, the need for rest wins eventually. Underground nights reward those who yield. As the room settles into shared sleep, warmth accumulates gently. The air thickens slightly, but not enough to disturb you. This balance is fragile and familiar. You have learned to recognize when it tips too far in either direction. Tonight it holds. Sleep arrives not as escape, but as agreement. But as agreement. You accept the limits of the space, and in return the space holds you steady against the cold above. You wake to the quiet reminder that the earth is never truly dry. Moisture announces itself slowly, not with drama, but with texture. The wall near your shoulder feels darker this morning. The floor carries a faint chill that was not there yesterday. Nothing is wrong yet. This is simply how underground spaces breathe. Dampness is not a failure of construction. It is a condition of the environment. Frontier winters made this especially clear. When the ground outside froze solid and snow piled high, moisture had nowhere easy to go. It lingered. People learned to read these signs early because ignoring them carried consequences. Wet bedding stole heat faster than cold air ever could. You kneel and pressed your fingers into the dirt floor. It yields slightly, leaving a print that fills in slowly. This tells you what you need to know. The earth is holding water. Not dripping, just holding. That means today's work will include managing moisture as carefully as you manage fire. You scatter fresh straw where sleeping bodies had warmed the ground overnight. Straw does not stop dampness, but it lifts you above it. This small separation matters. Many winter records mention constant efforts to keep bedding dry, even if walls never fully were. People accepted wet walls. Wet blankets were another matter entirely. Mud becomes part of life here. It tracks in on boots, it clings to hems, it dries cracks, then returns with the next change in temperature. You stop thinking of cleanliness the way you once did. Clean now means functional. If something does not rot or freeze, it is good enough. There is disagreement among modern researchers about how much mold affected underground shelters. Some argue that constant airflow and cold temperatures limited growth. Others point to descriptions of musty smells and spoiled belongings as evidence that dampness caused real problems. The surviving accounts are uneven. What they share is awareness. People notice dampness immediately, even if they did not always know how to defeat it. You adjust the floor, slightly scraping away the worst patches and adding dry earth where you can. This is not a permanent fix. There are no permanent fixes underground. There is only attention. Small corrections repeated often. One strange but telling habit shows up in a handful of winter diaries. Some settlers burned dried grasses or herbs, not just for warmth or scent, but because they believed smoke helped dry the air. Whether this had any real effect is unclear, but the practice suggests how desperate people were to feel some control over moisture. Smoke at least made dampness feel challenged. You notice how moisture changes sound. Footsteps are quieter. Fabric makes a softer noise when it moves. Even your breathing feels different in humid air. The shelter feels heavier somehow, as if the earth is leaning closer to day. By midday, you open the entrance briefly, despite the cold, just to let fresh air rush through. The exchange is sharp and brief. Cold pause in damp air slips out. You close it quickly, but the difference lingers. The room feels lighter. This small ritual appears often in winter descriptions. People sacrificed heat for dryness when they could afford it. You hang clothing where air moves most near the ceiling or opening. It will not fully dry, you know that, but it will dry enough to be worn again. Layers smell of earth and dew, and that smell becomes familiar. It signals survival more than neglect. As evening returns, moisture settles again. You accept it, you work around it. Underground life is not about defeating nature, it is about staying just ahead of its quieter inconveniences. When you lie down, you choose your place, carefully avoiding the coolest patches. The earth feels closer tonight, slightly heavier. Still it holds. Dampness is a problem, but it is a slow one. And slow problems can be managed with patience. Sleep comes knowing that tomorrow will bring the same quiet negotiations. Not battles, negotiations. And for now, that is enough. Fire feels different underground. You sense it before you see it, a cautious presence rather than a bold one. Here, flame is not a centerpiece. It is a tool that must behave. You kneel close as you coax it awake, careful with every movement, aware that heat and danger arrive together in this space. The hearth is small by design. There is no room for spectacle. Flames that leap too high waste warmth and invite smoke to linger where it does not belong. Frontier households quickly learned that underground fires worked best when they were steady and restrained. Large blazes belonged outdoors or in wide cabins. Below ground, modest heat kept everyone alive. You watch the fire's reflection flicker against damp walls. Light trembles, heat settles slowly, spreading outward instead of racing upward. This is one of the quiet advantages of underground living. Warmth stays where you need it. It does not escape easily, but that also means mistakes stay with you longer. You keep fuel nearby, but not stacked carelessly. Wood is dry only if protected, and protection underground is always temporary. You turn pieces, often letting air touch every side. This routine appears again and again in winter recollections. Fire management was not an event. It was a constant background task like breathing. There remains uncertainty among historians. How often fires were left burning overnight in dugouts? Some accounts describe embers banked carefully until morning. Others suggest fires were extinguished entirely to preserve air quality. The choice likely depended on how well the shelter vented and how many people slept inside. What mattered was judgment. Poor judgment did not forgive easily. You adjust the vent again as push curls upward. It hesitates, then finds its way out. Your eyes sting briefly, then clear. This is the margin you live within. Too little fire invites cold, too much steals breath. Underground life sharpens awareness because consequences arrive quietly. An odd practice appears in several personal stories. Some families kept a bucket of earth near the hearth at all times, not just for extinguishing flames, but to scatter lightly over embers before sleep. The soil slowed burning without fully smothering heat. Whether this was widely effective is difficult to say, but the habit itself reveals how cautious people became around fire below ground. As the room warms, you feel the difference immediately. Muscles loosen, fingers gain flexibility. The shelter responds like a held breath, finally released. This reaction reinforces why fire mattered, even when earth held warmth well. Heat did not only fight cold, it restored movement. You sit back, letting warmth reach you gradually. Sudden heat creates moisture problems. Slow heat keeps walls calmer. This balance is learned through repetition, not instruction. Many settlers likely ruined early shelters by overheating them before learning restraint. Evening settles and you lower the fire deliberately. The glow softens. The room keeps its warmth longer now. You feel satisfaction not from comfort but from control. Underground mastery looks like quiet stability rather than abundance. When you lie down, the fire has become embers, and embers have become assurance. The earth holds the warmth, the ceiling holds steady, fire has done its work without demanding attention. You close your eyes knowing that tomorrow fire will need you again. Not dramatically, just patiently. And here patience is the most reliable fuel of all. You hear the earth before you trust it. The sound is faint, almost imagined at first, a soft settling, a muted shift. It happens somewhere above your head, but not directly. Underground sound loses direction. It arrives without a clear source, and that uncertainty makes you listen more carefully than you ever did above ground. You pause what you're doing and wait. Nothing else follows. No rush of dirt, no sharp crack. Just silence returning to its familiar weight. This is how the ground speaks most of the time. Quietly, indirectly, never in complete sentences. People who lived underground during frontier winters often wrote about learning a new language made entirely of sounds. A creak meant one thing, a dull thump meant another. Wind above sounded different when snow drifted heavy against the roof. These distinctions mattered. They told you when to relax and when to move. You tilt your head slightly and listen again. The walls feel solid. The ceiling holds. Whatever shifted has finished shifting. Earth settles the way people do after finding a better position. Slowly, permanently. You realize that most of the noises you hear underground are not warnings, they're adjustments. Soil responding to temperature, wood responding to moisture, pressure redistributing itself quietly. Above ground movement often signals danger. Below ground, stillness is suspicious. Change is normal. This understanding does not arrive all at once. Early nights are restless. Every small sound pulls you halfway awake. You imagine collapse where there is none. Over time, experience sorts fear from information. The earth makes noise even when everything is fine. One thing winter accounts consistently reveal is how quickly settlers learn this distinction. Panic wastes energy. Energy is survival. People adapted not by silencing fear, but by teaching it when to speak. You notice how sound travels differently here. Voices do not carry far. A cough feels louder than it should. Tools striking earth sound softer than expected. Even your own footsteps seem absorbed by the walls. The ground eats noise. This makes the shelter feel private in a way cabins rarely did. At night, this muffling becomes more pronounced. Wind howls above but reaches you only as a low, distant pressure. Storms announce themselves through vibration rather than sound. You feel them in the floor before you ever hear them. Some modern researchers have wondered whether this constant low-level vibration affected sleep or nerves. There is no clear answer. Personal writings suggest that some people found it soothing, like being rocked. Others never fully trusted it. Both responses appear side by side in winter journals, sometimes written by the same hand weeks apart. You lie down and let the sounds wash over you. The faint crackle of cudgeling embers, the slow inhale and exhale of shared breathing. Somewhere above, snow slides a little, redistributing its weight. You feel that more than you hear it. The roof responds by holding firm. There is a particular sound that takes time to accept. A subtle, steady creaking that comes from the support settling under pressure. It is not loud. It does not repeat rhythmically. It simply exists. At first you interpret it as danger. Later you understand it as reassurance. Movement means flexibility. Rigid things break. Flexible things endure. A small but memorable habit shows up in a few underground winter recollections. Some settlers knock gently on their walls before sleeping, not to test strength but to listen. The sound told them how compact the soil had become. A dull response meant stability. A hollow one meant work tomorrow. This practice sounds odd now, but it made perfect sense when walls were your lifeline. You find yourself doing the same without thinking. A light tap, a pause. The sound comes back muted and dense. Good enough. As the night deepens, the shelter grows quieter. Not silenceux, but contained. You begin to distinguish which noises belong to the earth and which belong to you. This separation matters. It gives your mind something solid to hold on to. There is still uncertainty in the historical record about how often dugouts collapsed during winter. Some sources suggest it was rare once shelters were properly packed and supported. Others hint that small failures were common, but underreported fixed quietly before becoming disasters. What is clear is that people listened constantly. Sound was the earliest warning system available. You drift towards sleep with this awareness still active but no longer sharp. The earth murmurs occasionally. The roof settles a fraction. Nothing asks for your attention. Above ground night is filled with noise that reminds you how exposed you are. Underground sound does the opposite. It confirms enclosure. It tells you that the world is pressing in but being held back successfully. You adjust your position and feel the space respond with a soft, familiar shift. The earth makes room the way it always does, reluctantly but reliably. Tonight the sounds mean safety. You begin to realize that daylight has lost its authority here. Tasks no longer arrange themselves around sunrise and sunset. Instead, they fall into place according to necessity. When something must be done, you do it. When energy fades, you stop. Time becomes something you feel rather than measure. You wake and begin moving without knowing the hour. The lamp is lit, then lowered, then lit again later. Meals happen when hunger insists. Rest arrives when your body slows enough to accept it. This pattern appears repeatedly in winter recollections from underground shelters. Clocks existed, but they mattered less than rhythm. Chores take on a different character when the sun cannot supervise them. You clean slowly not because you are careful, but because the space encourages it. Fast movements stir dust and damp air. Slow ones keep everything settled. You sweep in short strokes. You stack supplies with memory rather than sight. You know where things belong because they always belong there. Underground life rewards consistency. Change creates work. You learn this quickly. Fetching water becomes a calculated task. You wait until several needs align before opening the door. Fresh air, snow removal, a glance at the sky, all combined into one brief exposure. Frontier families often describe bundling outdoor tasks together this way in winter, minimizing how often heat and calm were lost. Efficiency replaced comfort as the guiding principle. When you return inside, the door closes with a dull finality. Sound softens immediately. The shelter exhales. You feel it in your shoulders. This return becomes one of the day's small pleasures. Food preparation is quieter here. Boiling, simmering, waiting. Strong smells linger longer than expected. You learn to appreciate simple meals not just for sustenance, but because they do not overwhelm the space. Heavy frying leaves traces that hang in the air for hours. Simpler cooking keeps the shelter breathable. There is uncertainty among historians about how varied diets remained during the harshest underground winters. Some accounts suggest surprising variety due to preserved foods and trading networks. Others describe months of near monotony. What is consistent is adaptation. People adjusted expectations rather than fighting scarcity. You clean again, wipe condensation from surfaces, shift bedding to drier spots. These small acts fill time without exhausting it. Underground chores rarely feel finished. They feel paused. One curious routine shows up in several personal stories. Some settlers sang quietly while working not for entertainment but to track time. A song provided structure where daylight did not. Whether this was common or simply memorable is unclear, but the idea makes sense. Sound became a clock when light could not. You pause, often listening to the shelter as you work. Air, walls, fire, each element gives feedback. Too much smoke, too much dampness, too much silence. You respond accordingly. Underground life sharpens this responsiveness. You are always in conversation with your surroundings. By what you assume is midday, the air feels slightly warmer. Not because the sun has reached you directly, but because the ground has held on to yesterday's heat just long enough to release a little more. This delayed response teaches patience. Cause and effect are separated by hours here, sometimes by days. You sit and rest without guilt. Rest is not idleness underground, it is preparation. Overexertion leads to mistakes, and mistakes cost more here than anywhere else. This understanding shows up frequently in winter diaries. People learn to pace themselves, or they paid for it. As the day drifts on, tasks repeat, sweep, adjust, check, eat, rest. None of it feels dull. Repetition becomes calming when survival depends on it. The mind stops searching for novelty. It settles into pattern. There is debate among scholars about whether this kind of routine reduced stress or increased it over long winters. Evidence supports both interpretations. Some settlers described comfort in predictability. Others described restlessness that crept in slowly. The same routine that soothed one person unsettled another. You prepare for night without marking the transition. The lamp is lowered, the fire is banked, bedding is arranged. These actions signal rest more clearly than darkness ever could. When you lie down, you realize that the day has passed without resistance. No rushing, no waiting, just a steady sequence of small necessary acts. Underground time is not something to defeat, it is something to occupy gently. Sleep comes easier when the day has been shaped this way. The shelter feels balanced. Nothing demands immediate attention. Above ground night has probably claimed the land again. Below it makes little difference. Your eyes close knowing that tomorrow will unfold in much the same way. And for now, sameness feels like security. Cold changes how you think about food. Above ground meals are moments. Underground they're systems. You do not just eat to feel full, you eat to avoid waste, to preserve warmth, to make sure nothing spoils quietly while you sleep. Hunger behaves differently here. It arrives slower, but it lingers longer. You move toward the storage area without looking. Your hands already know where everything lives. Containers are set low close to the floor where the temperature stays most consistent. Underground cold does not bite the same way surface cold does. It settles, it holds. That steadiness turns the earth itself into a kind of caretaker. Frontier households learned early that buried or partially buried storage kept food usable far longer than anything left exposed. Root cellars were not a luxury invention. They were a direct response to winter reality. Potatoes stayed firm, dried meat resisted mold. Even butter survived longer when protected by soil and cold air working together. You lift a lid and breathe in. The smell tells you what you need to know before sight does. Fresh, safe, worth keeping. Underground living trains the senses to work in this order. Smell first, touch second, sight last. Light is too unreliable to lead. You notice frost along the edge of one container. That means the temperature dipped overnight. Not dangerously, but enough to leave a trace. You shift the container slightly closer to the wall away from the door side. These small adjustments prevent loss weeks later. Storage is never static. It responds to weather you do not see. There is still uncertainty among researchers about how often underground storage truly prevented starvation versus simply delaying it. Some winter records describe families stretching supplies remarkably well. Others describe loss from spoilage rodents or simple miscalculation. What remains consistent is effort. People constantly checked, rotated, and rationed. Nothing was forgotten once buried. You prepare a simple meal, nothing elaborate. Complexity wastes fuel and time. Underground cooking favors reliability. Boiling softens, simmering preserves. Everything is done slowly enough to avoid filling the space with heavy smells. One peculiar detail appears in a handful of winter accounts. Some settlers buried containers inside the dugout itself beneath the floor, creating a second layer of storage protected from freezing. The practice sounds extreme, but it reflects trust in the Earth's ability to regulate itself. Whether this method worked consistently is difficult to prove, but those who used it believed in it strongly. You eat carefully, aware of how food feels in your body afterward. Warmth spreads gradually. Energy returns without spike or crash. This is another reason underground meals tended to be plain. Dramatic eating leads to dramatic consequences in tight spaces. Afterward, you return leftovers to their place immediately. Leaving food out invites problems. Mice, insects, and spoilage all move faster than you expect underground. Earth shelters warmth and life equally. Boundaries must be maintained. You wipe your hands and sit quietly for a moment listening. Storage areas have their own sounds. A soft scrape, a faint rustle. You learn to distinguish harmless movement from trouble. A mouse is a nuisance. A colony is a crisis. As the day passes, you check supplies again. Not because something has changed, but because attention itself prevents disaster. This habit appears again and again in winter recollections. People survive not through clever tricks, but through constant noticing. There is disagreement among scholars about whether underground living improved food security overall. Some argue that stable temperatures help preserve stores better than surface cabins. Others point out that dampness and pests created new vulnerabilities. The truth seems uneven, shaped by soil-type climate and how disciplined a household remained. As evening settles, you feel calmer knowing where your food is and how long it will last. Certainty is comforting in winter, even limited certainty. You lie back, stomach, warm body steady. The earth beneath you holds more than shelter. It holds tomorrow's meals waiting quietly. Sleep comes easier when hunger has been answered and the future feels briefly manageable. You notice smell before anything else. It drifts toward you gently, not sharp enough to alarm, but distinct enough to demand attention. Underground scent travels slowly and stays longer. It does not disperse the way it would in open air. It settles into fabric, into walls, into memory. You pause what you're doing and breathe in deliberately. Smoke faint and familiar. Damp earth, always present. And something else, subtle, organic, new. This is how you learn to trust your nose. People living below ground relied on scent in ways that feel foreign now. Light was unreliable, sound could mislead. Smell arrived early and spoke clearly. Spoiling food announced itself before it could be seen. Bad air revealed itself long before breath grew shallow. Winter journals often mention noticing problems by smell first, even if the writer could not always name what they sensed. You follow the scent to its source. A cloth folded near the wall has absorbed too much moisture. It smells heavy, sour at the edges. Not dangerous yet, but moving in that direction. You lift it and reposition it closer to where air moves. This small act prevents a larger problem later. Underground living sharpens these instincts quickly. You do not analyze them, you act. Delays cost more here than mistakes. You return to your seat and notice how your own body contributes to the shelter's atmosphere. Sweat from work lingers. Breath leaves warmth and moisture behind. Even clean skin carries a scent that becomes part of the space. Privacy dissolves underground, not just physically, but sensorially. Everyone is present all the time. There are differing views among modern historians about how oppressive these constant smells felt to those living through them. Some descriptions suggest discomfort and complaint. Others describe a kind of acceptance, even familiarity. Smell becomes background rather than intrusion once it stops changing. What unsettles people is not a door itself, but new odour. You add a small amount of fuel to the fire and let it burn briefly. The smoke shifts the balance of the room. Earth scent softens, dampness retreats slightly. This is not about masking, it is about adjustment. Underground air is not meant to be neutral, it is meant to be managed. One quietly inventive habit shows up in a few personal recollections. Some families hung small bundles of dried plants near vents or doorways, not for decoration, but because they believed certain scents helped them judge airflow. When the smell faded quickly, air was moving. When it lingered, something needed attention. Whether this was accurate hardly mattered. It gave people a sense of control. You notice how scent marks time. Morning smells differ from evening ones. Fire food bodies earth. Each phase of the day leaves its trace. You begin to recognize when it is time to rest simply because the room smells tired. This awareness extends to illness. Cold sickness announces itself subtly underground. Breath changes. Skin carries a sharper note. These signs arrive before fever or pain. Families learn to respond early, extra covering, adjusted fire, quiet care without discussion. There is still uncertainty about how effective these early interventions were, but what is clear is attentiveness. People watched each other closely in winter because ignoring small changes had consequences. Underground, nothing hides for long. As night approaches, scents settle into something stable. Nothing new intrudes. That is reassuring. Stability, even when imperfect, signals safety. You lie back and breathe slowly. The air smells lived in but not threatening. Familiar. That familiarity allows rest. Sleep comes knowing that if something changes, you will smell it first, and that knowledge, strange as it sounds, feels like comfort. Illness announces itself underground in whispers. Not pain at first, not drama, just small shifts that feel easy to ignore if you're not paying attention. Fingers stay cold longer than they should. Breath feels heavier, less willing to move. Muscles ache without a clear reason. These changes matter here more than they would above ground. You notice them early because you've learned to watch your body the same way you watch the walls and fire. Cold magnifies weakness. What feels minor in daylight can become dangerous by nightfall. This understanding shows up repeatedly in winter recollections, not as theory but as habit. Care underground is practical and quiet. There is no space for panic. Someone adjusts your covering. The fire is fed slightly more than usual. Movement slows. Conversation fades. Rest is encouraged without argument. The goal is not diagnosis. It is containment. Warmth becomes the first response to nearly everything. Not intense heat, but steady presence. Underground warmth supports the body without shocking it. Sudden changes strain systems already under pressure. People learned this through repetition rather than instruction. You rest more when needed. Work pauses. This is not kindness, it is strategy. Overexertion leads to longer recovery, and winter does not wait. Many frontier families wrote about shifting labour away from those who showed early signs of sickness, even when that meant others worked harder. Survival depended on keeping as many bodies functional as possible. There are mixed interpretations among historians about how effective underground living was in protecting people from winter illness. Some argue that stable temperatures reduced exposure stress. Others point to dampness and close quarters as contributors to lingering sickness. The evidence does not settle comfortably on one side. What remains consistent is adaptation. People adjusted care routines to the environment they had. You notice how sound changes when someone is unwell. Breathing becomes more noticeable. Movement slows. The shelter itself seems to respond, becoming quieter, more contained. Underground spaces encourage this kind of attentiveness. There is nowhere for suffering to hide. One subtle practice appears in scattered accounts. Some families positioned the unwell person closest to the warmest part of the shelter, even if it meant others endured colder spots. This was not framed as sacrifice, it was efficiency. A sick body required more energy to recover. The group adjusted around that reality. Food shifts too. Simple broths, warm liquids, nothing heavy. The smell alone feels supportive, and eating becomes less about nourishment and more about comfort. Underground comfort and healing overlap. As night approaches, you lie still, listening to your own breathing. It feels steady enough. That is reassuring. You have learned not to demand strength from your body in winter. You ask for steadiness instead. Sleep comes earlier when illness threatens. The body insists on it. Underground, that insistence is respected. Darkness arrives without fear. The shelter holds temperature. The fire is watched. Nothing more is required. By morning, small improvements feel significant. Breath moves easier. Fingers warm faster. These signs are celebrated quietly. There is no ceremony, just a return to routine. Illness does not disappear underground, but it is noticed sooner, managed earlier, and woven into daily life without drama. That attentiveness makes all the difference. You close your eyes again, trusting that rest, warmth, and patience will do their work. Children adapt faster than you expect. They do not question the ceiling height or the dimness. They do not measure space against what it used to be. They accept what exists and move within it naturally, curling into corners, inventing games that fit the boundaries instead of pushing against them. You watch this happen with a mix of relief and unease. Relief because their bodies conserve warmth easily, knees tucked in, shoulders rounded without complaint. Unease because adaptation looks a lot like forgetting. Underground winters reshape childhood quietly. Small hands learn the walls by touch. Fingers trace grooves in packed earth. Pebbles become treasures. Shadows turn into stories. Light is not expected to fill the room, so imagination does the work instead. This pattern shows up again and again in winter recollections, where adults remark that children complained less than they did, even when conditions were harsh. Sleep comes easily to them. Their breathing deepens quickly, bodies radiating warmth that helps everyone nearby. In tight shelters, this mattered more than sentiment. Young bodies were efficient heat sources, whether anyone said it aloud or not. There are accounts suggesting that children often slept in the centre of the shelter, flanked by adults. This arrangement was not about protection in the modern sense, it was about temperature stability. The warmest spots stayed where movement was least. The edges were colder. Children stayed in the middle because the middle worked best. You notice how rules soften around them underground. Noise is tolerated a little longer. Movement is allowed a little more freely. Winter presses hard on adults. Children provide motion that reminds the space it is still alive. One small habit appears in a few family stories. Some parents marked growth on dugout walls the way others marked doorframes, scratching faint lines into the earth itself. These marks rarely survived spring, but they mattered in the moment. Proof that time was still passing even when days blurred together. Learning continues underground, just differently. Skills replace lessons. Children learn to fetch items without light, to listen before speaking, to recognize when air feels wrong. These lessons arrive without instruction. The environment teaches them directly. There is uncertainty about how these winters affected long-term development. Some later accounts speak of resilience built early. Others hint at restlessness once children return to open spaces. Memory complicates interpretation. What feels like strength in hindsight may have felt like constraint at the time. Illness moves through children differently. They recover faster, but they also hide discomfort more easily. Adults watch closely. Extra coverings appear without explanation. Warm drinks are pressed into small hands. Care remains quiet, practical, constant. As evening settles, children grow still more quickly than adults do. Energy burns bright, then fades suddenly. They sleep wherever warmth collects bodies arranged without self-consciousness. The shelter adjusts around them. You lie back and listen to the softer rhythm of their breathing. It steadies the room, reminds you that survival is not only endurance, it is continuation. Underground winters are remembered differently through younger eyes. Less fear, less comparison, more immediacy. The space becomes normal because it must. Sleep comes knowing that adaptation does not always look like struggle. Sometimes it looks like quiet acceptance learned early and carried forward without comment. Loneliness underground does not come from being alone. It arrives even when bodies fill the space, when breathing overlaps and warmth gathers easily. It comes from the absence of distance. There is nowhere to step away, nowhere to look that does not end in earth. Privacy becomes a memory rather than a condition. You notice it in small ways. Conversations grow shorter. Silence stretches without explanation. People share space, but not always thought. Underground winters compress not just bodies, but emotions. This sensation appears quietly in winter recollections. Writers rarely named it directly. Instead, they described restlessness, irritation without cause, a need to step outside even when the cold bit hard, and the land above harsh as it was offered horizon. Below ground, the horizon disappears. You sit with your back against the wall and feel the weight of it. Earth does not give the illusion of openness. It closes in gently, consistently. Over time, this changes how you process emotion. Feelings flatten, extremes soften, everything moves toward the middle. Some families adapted by structuring solitude artificially. A corner became a place where no one interrupted. A walk outside, even brief, became a private ritual rather than a chore. Whether these strategies helped consistently is unclear. Accounts differ. What remains constant is the attempt. There are memories of people stepping out into storms not because work demanded it, but because their minds did. Cold felt preferable to containment, if only for a moment. These actions were rarely justified. They simply happened. You notice how closeness alters conflict. Arguments do not explode underground, they smoulder. Voices stay low. Grievances are stored rather than expressed. The space does not allow escalation. Everything must coexist. One subtle behavior shows up in personal stories. Some people rearrange small objects daily without reason, moving them back and forth. A cup shifts. A tool changes place. These acts create a sense of agency where options are limited. Control does not need to be large to be meaningful. As days pass, loneliness changes texture. It becomes less sharp, more like background hum. You stop resisting it as acceptance dulls its edge. There is uncertainty about how widespread emotional strain truly was in underground winters. Letters meant for family often softened reality. Diaries were not always complete. What survives is fragmentary, shaped by memory and restraint. Still enough descriptions align to suggest this experience was common even if unnamed. Night deepens and the shelter grows quiet. Shared breathing fills the space. You feel connected and isolated at the same time. This contradiction does not resolve, it simply exists. You lie back and let thoughts slow. Underground life does not offer escape from oneself. It offers containment. For some that brings calm, for others it brings friction. Sleep comes when resistance fades. The walls do not move, the ceiling holds. The earth remains patient. Loneliness settles too, no longer loud, just present. And in winter presence, without danger, is sometimes enough. Stories begin without invitation. No one announces them. No one clears a throat or claims the floor. A sentence simply appears in the dimness, spoken softly enough that it does not fight the space. The shelter adjusts around it. Attention gathers the way, warmth does gradually and without effort. You sit still and listen. Underground winters stretch long, and when movement slows, voices take on new importance. Storytelling is not entertainment added to the day. It is part of the work of getting through it. Words fill the hours when hands need rest and eyes cannot rely on light. You notice how firelight reshapes faces as someone speaks. Shadows soften expressions, details fade. The voice becomes the anchor. This makes listening easier. You're not distracted by gestures or surroundings. You follow tone and rhythm instead. People told the same stories repeatedly. Not because they lacked imagination, but because familiarity mattered. Predictable ending brought comfort. Knowing what came next reduced strain. Winter accounts often mention hearing the same tale many times with small changes slipping in as memory reshaped it. You realize that stories here serve a purpose similar to routine. They mark time. A certain story belongs to early winter. Another appears when supplies feel low. Others wait for nights when storms press close and silence feels too heavy. There are hints in surviving writings that storytelling underground followed unspoken rules. Voices stayed low. Interruptions were rare. Humour softened rather than sharpened. This was not performance, it was maintenance. One small habit appears in a few recollections. Some speakers paused intentionally at familiar moments, letting listeners fill in the rest silently. The shared knowledge created connection without sound. Whether this was deliberate or simply instinct is difficult to say, but the effect is clear. The room felt fuller when everyone participated quietly. You notice how stories drift between truth and invention. A hunting success grows larger with each telling. A winter storm becomes slightly more dramatic. These shifts are not lies. They are adjustments that help memory hold attention. Accuracy, matters less than meaning when survival is the priority. There is uncertainty among modern readers about how much of this storytelling reflected boredom versus emotional need. The sources do not agree. Some writers describe eagerness, others mention fatigue. What they share is persistence. Stories happened whether people felt inspired or not. Children listen closely even when pretending not to. They absorb cadence and pattern. Stories become lessons without instruction. Warnings are wrapped in narrative, advice arrives disguised as memory. Underground storytelling teaches without demanding effort. As the night deepens, voices grow softer. Sentences shorten, the story slows. Sometimes it fades out, entirely left unfinished. No one objects, completion is not required. You feel the shelter settle as words disappear. Silence returns, but it is different now, less empty, filled with shared images that linger briefly before dissolving. You lie back warmed not just by fire and bodies, but by the quiet connection stories create. Underground winters do not offer much distraction, but they offer this: shared memory spoken into darkness. Sleep comes with echoes of voices still present, gentle and familiar. The story ends without ending, and that feels right. Clothing never fully rests underground. It is always in use, drying, waiting, or being worn again before it is ready. Fabric here carries history. Smoke settles into it. Earth clings. Moisture never quite leaves. You stop expecting crispness early in the winter. You lift a sleeve and feel it between your fingers. It is warm enough, dry enough. That is the standard. Underground winters teach you to abandon perfection in favor of function. Layers matter more than cleanliness. Thickness matters more than appearance. Most frontier families relied on the same few garments through the entire cold season, repairing rather than replacing. Wool, when available, was prized because it held warmth even when damp. Cotton fared worse. Leather stiffened, then softened again with wear. These realities shape daily decisions in ways that rarely appear in tidy historical summaries, but surface repeatedly in personal recollections. You hang clothing where air moves, even if that movement is barely noticeable. Near the ceiling, close to the entrance, sometimes over a chair placed deliberately in the path of rising warmth. Drying is slow, you learn patience through fabric. There is lingering uncertainty about how often people truly manage to dry clothing fully during underground winters. Some accounts describe garments that never lost their smell of smoke until spring. Others suggest careful rotation kept things workable. The difference likely came down to attention and luck. A single damp week could undo months of careful management. You change layers thoughtfully. Sweat is an enemy in winter. Too much movement too fast traps moisture against the skin, and underground air does not forgive that mistake easily. People learn to work just hard enough, then pause, letting heat settle rather than spike. A small but telling habit appears in a few winter descriptions. Some settlers slept with the next day's clothing inside their bedding so it would be warm when morning came. This was not about comfort. Cold fabric against skin steals heat immediately. Preventing that loss mattered. You notice how clothing smells differently underground. Smoke blends with earth until neither stands out. This scent becomes associated with safety rather than neglect. It means fire burned recently. It means walls held. It means you are still here. Repairs happen constantly. A tear is stitched the moment it appears. Buttons are replaced with knots. Fabric is reinforced at stress points. Clothing does not get retired easily. Everything is needed. Nothing is wasted. As evening settles, you adjust layers again. Not thicker, just better placed. A scarf shifts. Sleeves are rolled down. The body teaches you what it needs if you listen closely enough. You lie back, fabric warm from use, carrying the weight of the day without complaint. Underground clothing is not an expression. It is an agreement between body and environment. Sleep comes wrapped in layers that smell familiar and feel reliable. That reliability matters more than comfort now. Animals are never as far away as you imagine. You hear them before you see them, if you see them at all. A shuffle against the wall, a faint scratch beneath the floor, a low sound from just beyond the entrance that might be wind or might not. Underground shelters blur the line between inside and outside in ways cabins never quite do. Livestock often stay close in winter, not out of affection, but practicality. Warmth collects where bodies gather. Dugouts blew into hillsides or banks sometimes shared a wall with animal shelters. This arrangement was common enough to feel normal at the time, even if it sounds uncomfortable now. Animals provided heat. People provided care. The exchange worked as long as boundaries held. You listen carefully when you hear movement. A mouse sounds different from a larger creature. Rodents are expected. They come with stored food and warmth. Larger animals demand attention. You keep tools nearby, not out of fear, but readiness. The earth wall feels thinner in these moments, not weak, just permeable. Sound passes through soil unevenly. A hoof step above may vibrate faintly below. A body brushing past the outer wall may feel like pressure rather than noise. There is no single account that agrees on how often animals breached underground shelters. Some stories suggest frequent intrusion. Others mention rare incidents remembered because they were unusual. Memory exaggerates what startles. Routine blends into background. What is clear is that people expected animals to test boundaries, especially when cold drove everything toward warmth. You adjust the entrance, reinforcing it with whatever is close at hand. Branches, sod, packed snow. The goal is not to create a barrier nothing can cross. It is to slow movement enough to notice it. One odd but practical behaviour appears in scattered winter recollections. Some settlers left small amounts of food deliberately outside their shelters, hoping to distract animals from probing inside. Whether this strategy worked reliably is unclear, but the logic makes sense. A fed animal is less persistent than a desperate one. Smell matters again here. Animals follow scent more than sound. You learn to manage scraps carefully. Nothing lingers near the entrance longer than necessary. Waste is buried or burned. Underground life sharpens this discipline quickly. At night, animal sounds feel closer. Darkness collapses distance. A snort or shuffle seems immediate, even when it is not. You remain still and listen. Most of the time the sound fades, curiosity passes, the shelter holds. There is disagreement about whether proximity to animals reduced or increased stress during winter. Some accounts describe comfort in knowing livestock were nearby and alive. Others describe constant irritation and worry. The same arrangement could feel reassuring one night and exhausting the next. You lie back and feel vibrations travel through the floor as something moves above. The earth absorbs most of it, but not all. The presence is undeniable. This is not isolation. This is shared survival. Eventually the sounds settle. Animals find their own rest. The shelter returns to quiet. You breathe easier without realizing you are holding your breath. Underground winters erase the illusion of separation between human life and the natural world. Everything presses inwards toward warmth and shelter. Tonight the earth holds you, and the animals remain just outside, close enough to remind you that survival here is collective, whether you want it to be or not. Sleep comes with that awareness still humming gently in the background. You feel the storm before you understand it. The floor carries a faint vibration that was not there before. Not strong enough to alarm, just present enough to notice. Underground weather announces itself through pressure and sound rather than sight. The sky may be white with wind and snow, but you learn about it through the ground's response. You pause and listen. The shelter answers back with stillness. That tells you something important. Whatever is happening above the walls are holding. Blizzards do not roar underground. They press. Wind pushes against the land, and the land passes that pressure along gently like a hand resting heavier on your shoulder. Snow adds weight, but also insulation. Once it piles high enough, the world above becomes quieter rather than louder. People who wintered underground often describe storms as something they experienced indirectly. They did not see snow drifting sideways, or feel ice cut their faces. Instead, they noticed how sound changed, how air movement slowed even further, how the shelter felt more sealed than usual. The storm became a condition rather than an event. You sit closer to the wall and feel its temperature. It is unchanged. That steadiness is reassuring. Underground shelters were chosen precisely for this reason. Wind can strip heat from exposed surfaces relentlessly, but soil resists sudden change. What arrives does so slowly. You hear a dull thump above, followed by silence. Snow sliding from a drift. Not collapse, just redistribution. The roof responds with patience. This is one of those moments when trust replaces fear. You have learned the difference. There are mixed impressions in winter records about how frightening storms felt underground. Some writers recalled calm, even boredom, while blizzards raged unseen. Others admitted to unease imagining forces they could not observe. The same storm could feel protective one night and oppressive the next. Context mattered. Fatigue mattered. Confidence in construction mattered. You bank the fire slightly, not because it is colder, but because you anticipate needing steady heat for longer. Underground planning always looks ahead. You respond not to the present moment, but to what it suggests. One practical habit appears in a few recollections. Some families knocked snow from their roofs during storms by tapping the support beams from inside, listening for the change in sound as snow shifted above. It was a quiet way to manage weight without exposure. Whether it always helped is uncertain, but it gave people something to do while waiting. Time stretches during storms. With no visual cues, minutes blur. You measure passing hours by routine. Check the fire, feel the walls, listen again. The shelter becomes the entire world until the storm loosens its grip. At night, vibrations increase slightly. Wind finds new angles. Snow moves again. None of it feels sharp, just persistent. You breathe slowly and let the earth do its work. Eventually the pressure eases. Not suddenly, just enough that you notice the absence. The shelter relaxes, air shifts, sound opens a little. You know the storm has passed without ever seeing it. That knowledge feels strange and satisfying at the same time. Above ground, survival is loud. Below it is quiet and deliberate. You lie back and let the calm settle fully. The storm has spent itself against the land, and the land has protected you without asking for attention. Sleep comes easily after that, carried on the sense that the worst can happen above while safety remains below. Work never truly stops underground. It only changes pace. Even on days when you rest more than you move, attention keeps working quietly in the background. You notice the way the ceiling looks this morning, a faint sag that may have been there before, or maybe not. Underground certainty is rare. You respond anyway. You press gently against a support and feel how it answers back. Solid. That is enough for now. Maintenance here is not dramatic. It is constant and incremental. A little soil packed tighter, a small wedge adjusted. These acts rarely make stories later, but they fill winter days. People who lived this way learned quickly that shelters did not fail all at once. They weakened, slowly announcing themselves through changes that were easy to miss if you were careless. That is why work continued even when there was nothing obvious to fix. Attention itself was labour. You move along the wall, smoothing loose patches where moisture has softened the surface. Packed earth hardens again when cared for. Left alone, it slumps. This relationship becomes familiar. The shelter gives stability in exchange for effort. There are winter descriptions of people reinforcing walls repeatedly after storms. Not because damage had occurred, but because snowmelt and pressure altered conditions subtly. Some days felt like rebuilding the same thing over and over. That repetition was not failure. It was how underground structures survived long seasons. You pause, often listening as you work. Sound tells you when a tool strikes too hard, when soil resists, when it gives too easily. Your hands learn what your eyes cannot confirm. One small but telling behaviour appears in scattered recollections. Some settlers kept a simple stick or tool, specifically for tapping walls and supports, not for repair but for checking tone. A dull response meant strength. A sharper one meant more packing was needed. The practice feels intuitive once learned. You notice how effort warms the space just enough. Movement generates heat that lingers longer than it would above ground. This makes work easier here than in exposed cabins where cold steals warmth immediately. Underground labour pays you back slowly. There is uncertainty about how often these shelters required major reinforcement versus minor daily care. Records blur routine and crisis together. What remains clear is that people stayed busy. Idleness invited problems. Motion prevented them. As the day progresses, you move from one small task to another. Tighten, smooth, adjust. Nothing feels finished. Everything feels improved. That is the rhythm. By evening, you feel tired without being exhausted. The kind of fatigue that settles into muscles without sharpening pain. This is the reward of steady effort. You sit back and survey the space. It looks much the same. That means the work succeeded. Underground success often looks like nothing changed. Night approaches quietly again. You bank the fire and settle in. The walls hold, the ceiling rests. Tomorrow you will do it all again, not because something will break overnight, but because it might. Sleep comes knowing that survival here is not about heroic effort. It is about showing up every day and listening closely. Fear does not arrive underground with a clear shape. It seeps in quietly, carried on thoughts that arrive uninvited when the room is still. You lie awake and imagine the ceiling above you, not as something solid, but as something that could change. Earth feels permanent until you remember it once moved to make this space. That memory lingers. You listen closely for sounds that mean trouble. Not the familiar settling you've learned to accept, but something sharper, something urgent. Most nights nothing comes. Fear waits anyway, patient and imaginative. People who spent winters underground often wrote less about collapse than you might expect. When they mentioned it at all, it appeared briefly, almost casually tucked between notes about weather and chores. This suggests something important. Fear was present, but it did not dominate. It stayed in the background where it could be managed. You reach up and press your palm against the ceiling. The earth feels dense, cool, unmoving. Touch reassures more than sight ever could hear. You learn to trust what your hands tell you. Still, the thought returns now and then. What if spring comes too fast? What if thaw loosens what winter packed tight? These questions have no immediate answers. You do not dwell on them because dwelling wastes energy. Underground life rewards focus on what can be done today. Some families reinforce roofs far beyond what seemed necessary, adding extra layers of sod or timber simply to sleep better. Whether this truly increased safety or merely comfort is difficult to know. What matters is that peace of mind carried its own value during long winters. You notice how fear behaves differently underground. It does not spike. It hums, a low, constant presence that sharpens awareness without demanding panic. This may be why people adapted as well as they did. Fear became information rather than command. There are recollections of people waking suddenly convinced something had shifted only to find everything unchanged. Over time, these false alarms decreased. Experience filtered imagination. The earth taught discernment through repetition. You adjust your position slightly and feel the shelter respond with a faint familiar sound. It settles back into stillness. That response matters. It confirms the system is flexible, not brittle. As night deepens, thoughts slow. The ceiling stops being an idea and returns to being a fact. Earth above, earth around, holding. You breathe evenly and let the quiet do its work. Fear remains, but it no longer leads. It stands watch instead, alert but restrained. Sleep comes when you accept that safety underground is never absolute, but it is sufficient. And sufficient in winter is everything. Connections between shelters form quietly. You do not see them at first. There are no roads carved clearly through the snow, no signs pointing the way. Instead, there are paths remembered by feet, routines aligned by need. Underground living does not isolate people completely. It changes how they reach each other. You prepare to leave briefly, bundling yourself with practiced movements. Visits are purposeful in winter. No one wanders without reason. Tools are carried. News is exchanged. Help moves in both directions without ceremony. When you step outside, the cold feels sharper than you remembered. It always does. Your body adjusts quickly. muscles tightening, breath shortening. You move fast, knowing the shelter behind you is holding warmth that will be lost if you linger too long. Neighbouring dugouts sit low against the land, nearly invisible beneath snow and grass. From a distance, they seem like absences rather than structures. You know where they are because you have learned the land by repetition, not markers. Inside another shelter, the air feels familiar but not identical. Each dugout develops its own balance. Smells differ slightly. Warmth settles in different places. You notice these things immediately. Underground spaces carry personality. People share information first. Who is low on fuel? Who has extra food? Who's feeling unwell? This exchange happens naturally without formal agreement. Winter enforces cooperation. Isolation is dangerous when resources are thin. There are hints in winter letters that communities underground relied on these quiet networks more than surface dwellers did. Distance felt greater when travel was limited and visibility poor. Helping nearby families became a form of insurance. You helped now, so help would come later. Tools move between shelters often. A shovel, a pot, a repair tool passed hand to hand. Ownership softens in winter. What matters is function. Possession becomes secondary. One small habit appears in scattered memories. Some neighbours knocked on the earth wall rather than the door, listening for a response before entering. The sound carried differently underground. A tap answered by a tap meant all was well. Silence meant caution. This language developed naturally, shaped by environment. You sit briefly, exchanging warmth and quiet conversation. Words are economical. No one wastes breath. News travels efficiently without embellishment. This restraint feels respectful rather than cold. There is uncertainty about how evenly this cooperation was practiced. Some communities describe deep mutual reliance. Others hint at tension, scarcity, and resentment. Winter magnifies differences as much as it forges bonds. What remains clear is that survival rarely happened alone. You return to your shelter carrying something useful: extra fuel, advice, reassurance. The door closes and the space settles again. The exchange has changed nothing and everything at once. Underground winters shrink the world, but they do not erase it. Connections remain just quieter, closer, shaped by necessity rather than convenience. You lie back knowing that others are nearby, held by the same earth, listening to the same silence. That knowledge steadies you. Sleep comes easier when survival feels shared. Space below ground teaches rules without speaking them. You learn quickly where you belong at different moments of the day. Not because anyone tells you, but because movement itself becomes language. Certain areas invite activity. Others ask for stillness. These boundaries are soft yet firmly understood. Morning finds you closer to the fire. Tasks gather there naturally. Hands work, water warms, tools move in small arcs that avoid collisions. Later that same spot becomes a place to sit quietly, letting warmth settle without disturbance. The space shifts purpose without ever changing shape. Roles take form this way too, not announced, not assigned, simply absorbed through repetition. Someone always tends the fire best. Someone notices changes in air first. Someone remembers where supplies are buried. Underground winters favour consistency over fairness. What works continues. These patterns appear often in winter recollections, though rarely framed as roles in the modern sense. People described what happened rather than who was in charge. Responsibility followed attention. Whoever noticed a problem first usually solved it. You notice how movement differs depending on who is awake. When children stir, paths widen slightly, adults give way without comment. When illness is present, the shelter rearranges itself, quiet expands, activity contracts. These adjustments happen instinctively. Privacy becomes fluid rather than fixed. There are moments when closeness is expected, and others when silence is respected. Turning away can signal a need for space. Sitting still can mean availability. Underground life refines these cues quickly because a misunderstanding costs comfort. There is lingering uncertainty about how strictly gender shaped these spaces below ground. Some accounts suggest familiar divisions carried over unchanged. Others hint that winter blurred lines out of necessity. Tasks followed skill and stamina more than expectation. Memory complicates the picture, smoothing what may have felt sharper at the time. One subtle behaviour appears in a few personal memories. Some people claimed a particular spot as theirs, not by declaration but by habit. A place near the wall, a certain angle by the fire. Over time others avoided it automatically. Territory formed quietly. You notice how little walking happens underground. Most movement is reaching, leaning, turning in place. This minimizes disruption. It also conserves energy. Bodies learn to take up less space without being told. As evening approaches, roles soften. Work fades. Conversation grows sparse. The shelter seems to signal this shift by settling further into stillness. No one argues with it. You lie back and feel how naturally you fit where you are now. Not because it is ideal, but because it has been repeated enough to feel right. Underground winters teach belonging through routine. Sleep comes knowing that tomorrow the same space will guide you again, quietly shaping behaviour without instruction. Comfort arrives underground in ways you do not expect. It does not come as relief from cold or an end to work. It appears quietly, almost accidentally, in moments that would seem insignificant above ground. A place where warmth gathers reliably. A routine that no longer requires thought. A sound that confirms everything is holding as it should. You notice it first when you sit down without bracing yourself. Your body no longer scans for discomfort immediately. Muscles rest where they land. The floor feels familiar rather than hard. That shift surprises you. You did not realize you'd been waiting for it. The shelter has learned you and you have learned it. You know exactly where to sit to feel warmth without crowding the fire. You know which wall feels least damp day. You know how to lean so the ceiling does not intrude. These details form a map that exists only in memory and muscle. Once learned, they create ease. Many people who live through underground winters later describe moments of contentment that felt almost inappropriate given the conditions. They wrote about evenings that passed gently, about quiet satisfaction in small successes. This does not mean life was easy. It means the body and mind adapted enough to notice calm when it appeared. You sip something warm and feel it settle. Heat moves slowly through you, unhurried. Underground warmth does not rush. It arrives gradually and stays longer. That steadiness shapes emotion as much as temperature. Sharp feelings soften. Everything slows. You notice how the shelter sounds when it's comfortable. Not silent. Balanced. The fire murmurs without demanding attention. Walls remain still. Air moves just enough to feel fresh without stealing heat. These cues combine into reassurance. There are scattered references to people taking pride in their dugouts once they reach this stage. Pride not in appearance but in performance. A shelter that stayed dry enough, warm enough, safe enough. That pride mattered more than aesthetics during winter. One small, almost tender habit appears in a few recollections. Some settlers kept a simple object near them at all times underground. A smooth stone, a tool handle worn by use, something solid to hold during quiet moments. Whether this was superstition or comfort is unclear. What matters is that it helped anchor them. You realize that comfort here is not passive, it is maintained. You earned it through attention and repetition. That makes it feel reliable. You trust it because you understand what supports it. As evening deepens, you do not rush to prepare for night. Everything is already in place. Fire is ready. Bedding is dry enough. Air feels right. That readiness creates a sense of abundance even when supplies are limited. You lie back and feel the earth press evenly around you. The weight that once felt threatening now feels protective. It keeps cold and wind at a distance. It holds warmth close. It reduces the world to a manageable size. There is uncertainty about how often people reach this point of comfort during underground winters. Some accounts suggest it was fleeting. Others imply it lasted weeks at a time. Memory smooths hardship, but it also preserves truth. Enough people mention these moments to believe they were real. You close your eyes and listen. Nothing needs immediate attention. That absence is its own comfort. You're not waiting for disaster. You're simply present. Underground winters do not remove hardship. They change its shape. They allow small comforts to stand out clearly against difficulty. Those comforts sustain more than warmth. They sustain patience. Sleep arrives gently, carried on the sense that for now everything is balanced, and balance in winter feels like luxury. You hear stories from above ground and they sound harsher than what you live with now. Someone mentions a cabin where frost crept across the walls each night, thick enough to scrape away into the morning. Another speaks of wind slipping through every joint in the wood, turning sleep into a series of shivers. These accounts do not come with judgment. They are simply comparisons offered quietly the way winter information always is. You think about your own shelter and feel the difference immediately. Underground cold behaves differently. It does not hunt for gaps. It waits. That waiting gives you time. Time to adjust, time to respond, time to rest. Surface cabins promises space and light, but they demand constant defense. Fire must work harder. Walls must fight wind relentlessly. Underground shelters do not fight, they absorb. That absorption changes everything about daily survival. Many settlers who tried both approaches noted this contrast in personal writing. Above ground living felt exposed even when walls stood firm. Below ground living felt contained even when space was tight. Neither option was perfect. Winter made sure of that. But the trade-offs were clear enough to remember. You imagine the sound of wind hitting a cabin wall. Sharp, immediate, demanding. Underground, that same storm becomes pressure rather than assault. The earth diffuses what would otherwise arrive all at once. There is no agreement among later readers about which option was truly better. Some families abandoned in dugouts as soon as timber became available. Others stayed underground longer than planned, reluctant to trade steadiness for height. Preference followed experience rather than theory. You notice how much energy you conserve here. Not just physical energy, but mental. You're not constantly scanning for drafts. You're not bracing for sudden temperature drops. The shelter does that work quietly. That allows attention to shift inward. One small observation appears in a few winter memories. Some settlers who moved back above ground complained of noise. Wind felt louder. Nights felt less restful. After months, underground exposure became unfamiliar. This adjustment went both ways. The body learned what it practiced. You sit and feel the wall beside you. Cool, stable, unmoving. You think about how much material stands between you and the cold sky. Not much, really. Just earth arranged thoughtfully. That thought brings respect rather than fear. Underground living does not erase winter. It reshapes it. Cold remains. Darkness remains. But the way they arrive changes. They lose urgency. They become conditions instead of threats. As night settles again, you find yourself less curious about the world above. Snow can fall, wind can rise. You will learn about it indirectly through sound and pressure. That distance feels like relief. You lie back aware that when spring comes you may miss this containment. The way this world shrank to something manageable. The way survival felt deliberate rather than reactive. Sleep comes with that thought still present. Above ground, life will return eventually. For now, underground living feels like the right choice made not out of romance but out of understanding. You begin to feel uneasy before you know why. The air carries a different weight now. Not colder, not warmer, just altered. The floor feels slightly softer beneath your hand. The walls hold moisture in a way that was not there weeks ago. Underground spring announces itself quietly, and not always kindly. Snow above is melting, even if you have not seen it yet. Water finds paths before light does. It moves through soil, patiently testing every seam and compacted layer. What winter-packed tight thaw loosens without asking permission. You notice small changes first. A darker patch along the wall. A slow drip that appears, disappears, then returns. These signs do not cause panic. They cause work. Spring anxiety underground is not loud fear. It is vigilance. People who lived this way often described late winter and early spring as more stressful than the coldest months. Frozen ground was predictable. Thaw introduced uncertainty. Soil shifted. Roofs that felt immovable in January needed attention in March. You press against the wall again. It still holds, but it responds differently now, softer, more yielding. You adjust supports where you can, adding pressure gradually rather than forcing it. Underground repairs during thaw require patience. Sudden changes invite collapse. There is no clear agreement in surviving accounts about how dangerous this period truly was. Some suggest most failures happen during spring melt. Others describe dugouts lasting years with only minor seasonal adjustments. The difference likely came down to soil-type drainage and how carefully people watched for early warning signs. You scoop damp earth away from the floor and replace it with drier material. This task repeats daily now. What you fix today may need attention again tomorrow. That repetition wears on the nerves more than cold ever did. One quiet habit appears in a few recollections. Some settlers slept lightly during thaw, waking often to listen for changes, not because collapse was imminent, but because attentiveness felt necessary. Rest became fragmented. Caution replaced deep sleep. You open the entrance briefly, letting cool air move through. It carries a faint smell of water and earth renewed. Spring exists above whether you are ready for it or not. As days pass, the shelter requires more from you. Walls need smoothing, drainage paths must be kept clear. Fire management shifts again, not just for warmth but for drying. Balance becomes harder to maintain. You feel impatience rise at times. Winter asks endurance, spring asks flexibility. The difference matters. Endurance can be settled into. Flexibility demands constant adjustment. Eventually the changes stabilize. Water finds its preferred routes. The ground firms again, though differently than before. You learn the new version of the shelter the same way you learnt the old one. Through touch, through sound, through repetition. You lie down at night, knowing that winter's grip is loosening but not without cost. Underground living carried you safely through cold. Now it requires one last stretch of attention before release. Sleep comes lighter than before, but it still comes. The earth continues to hold even as it changes, and you change with it, readying yourself for the moment when going back above ground will no longer feel like risk. You step outside more often now, even when you do not need to. At first, you tell yourself it is practical. The thaw requires checks. Snowmelt must be watched. Air needs changing. But after a few days, the reason shifts. You feel an urge to look up, to let your eyes travel further than a few arm lengths before meeting a wall. The sky feels enormous. Light falls differently than you remember. It seems louder, somehow less contained. You squint not from brightness alone, but from scale. Space stretches outward again, and for a moment your body does not know how to stand in it. This reaction appears quietly in several frontier recollections. People describe feelings exposed when they first spent more time above ground after long underground winters. The openness felt unfamiliar. Safety had been defined by closeness for months. Now distance returns, and it takes time to trust it. You breathe deeply and notice how fast air moves out here. Wind does not ask permission. It passes through clothing, around limbs, across skin. Underground air lingered. This air rushes. The difference feels sharp. You do not stay long. Even now, the shelter calls you back sooner than expected. Not out of fear, but preference. The dugout feels balanced. The outside feels unsettled. Inside, the temperature barely reacts to your absence. The walls hold steady. The fire responds as expected. This reliability has trained your body to relax here. Above ground, everything feels temporary again. You begin to understand why some families delayed leaving their dugouts even after spring made surface living possible. It was not stubbornness, it was adaptation. The underground space had become calibrated to their needs. Abandoning it meant relearning exposure. One quietly noted behavior appears in a few memories. Some people stepped outside only at certain times of day, choosing moments when light felt gentler or wind less aggressive. Whether this was habit or instinct is unclear. but it suggests a gradual reintroduction to openness rather than a sudden return. You notice sounds more sharply now when outside: birds, water moving, distant voices. Underground silence trained your ears differently. These noises feel layered, almost crowded. You find yourself listening for the wrong things, expecting the ground to speak instead of the air. When you return inside, your shoulders drop slightly without conscious thought. The ceiling feels close again, but familiar. Weight returns, containment returns, and with it calm. There is uncertainty in the record about how long this transition took for most people. Some accounts suggest only a few days of adjustment. Others hint at lingering discomfort that lasted weeks. Memory tends to compress these shifts, smoothing them into single moments rather than processes. You begin leaving the door open a little longer now. Light spills in and lingers. Dust becomes visible in the beam. The shelter feels different with this intrusion, but not worse. Just changed. You learn to tolerate more openness gradually. Tasks move outside when possible. Drying fabric, sorting supplies, letting damp earth breathe. These activities mark the transition more clearly than any calendar. Winter loosens its grip not all at once, but through permission granted in small doses. You sit near the entrance and watch shadows move across the floor. They stretch farther than they did weeks ago. This feels like progress. Evidence that time has continued even when days blurred together underground. At night, you still prefer the shelter's embrace. Sleep comes easier and the ceiling is closed, so the outside world can wait until morning. Spring does not require urgency yet. You lie back and consider how different the world feels depending on where you stand. Above ground, safety comes from awareness and distance. Below ground, it came from enclosure and consistency. Neither is superior. They simply answer different questions. As sleep approaches, you realize that leaving the dugout will not be a single moment. It will be a series of small departures, each one slightly longer, each one slightly easier. For now, you are still here balanced between seasons, moving gradually toward the open sky without rushing. The earth has not released you yet, and you're not ready to leave it behind. You notice the changes in yourself before you notice them in the shelter. Your movements are quieter now, not because you're trying to be careful, but because your body has learned how to take up less space. You reach without knocking things over. You turn without brushing walls. These habits follow you even when you step outside, lingering longer than the winter that taught them. Underground living rewires instincts slowly. You still check where warmth gathers in a room before sitting down. You still listen for subtle shifts in sound before relaxing fully. Even in open air, part of you waits for the ground to respond. The earth taught you attentiveness, and that lesson does not fade quickly. People who spent long winters below ground sometimes wrote about this carryover in indirect ways. They described cabins feeling draftier than expected, rooms feeling wasteful, space feeling oddly loud. These reactions were not complaints so much as observations. The body remembered what worked. You arrange objects automatically with efficiency in mind, tools stay close, clothing is layered even when temperatures rise. You prepare for cold that may not come. This is not fear. It is habit formed through repetition and reward. There are hints in scattered accounts that some settlers missed underground life once it ended. Not the darkness or dampness, but the clarity. Underground winters stripped life down to essentials: warmth, air, food, structure. Above ground living reintroduced distraction along with comfort. You notice how patience has shifted. Waiting feels easier now. Delays no longer irritate the way they once did. Winter underground trained you to accept slow processes. Heat arrived gradually. Dryness took time. Solutions unfolded over days rather than moments. One small behavior remains with you. You pause before acting more often than before, just long enough to consider consequences. Underground quick decisions rarely helped. Thoughtful ones did. That habit persists. There is uncertainty about how universally these changes occurred. Some people likely returned to surface life eagerly shedding underground habits as soon as possible. Others carried them quietly into future seasons. Memory favors what feels meaningful, and meaning differs between individuals. You realize that underground winters altered your sense of safety. Openness no longer equals security by default. You understand now that safety can come from closeness, from containment, from things held steady rather than opposite. This realization reshapes how you evaluate risk. As you spend more time outside, these habits soften, but do not vanish. They become part of your baseline. You've learned something specific, something practical, and your body remembers as even when your mind moves on. At night, you still prefer spaces that feel enclosed. A corner, a wall nearby. Even above ground, you recreate the conditions that allowed you to rest. The Earth's influence lingers in these choices. You lie down and think about how winter underground did not just shelter you. It trained you. It taught you to notice what matters and ignore what does not. That lesson carries forward quietly without announcement. Sleep comes with the sense that this season has already changed you in ways you will only recognize later. The shelter may soon be left behind, but its logic stays close, shaping how you move through the world above. You remember the weight of the earth most clearly after it is no longer above you. It is not the physical pressure you miss, but the steadiness, the way everything important stayed close, the way the world narrowed until it felt manageable. Standing outside more often now, you feel how quickly space expands again. Sound travels farther. Light reaches places it never could underground. Possibility returns along with uncertainty. You visit the dugout one last time before leaving it behind. Inside, the air smells familiar. Earth, smoke, live time. The walls still carry the marks of hands that shaped them. The floor remembers where you slept, where warmth gathered, night after night. Nothing looks dramatic. That is what makes it meaningful. Living underground during the coldest frontier winters was never meant to be permanent. It was a response, a practical answer to limited resources, brutal weather and urgent need. People chose it because it worked well enough when other options failed. That truth sits quietly beneath every memory of these places. You understand now why so few physical traces remain. Earth shelters were not built to impress or endure beyond their purpose. They served, then returned to the land. What lasted was the knowledge carried forward by those who lived there. There is still disagreement among modern historians about how widespread underground living truly was and how many families relied on it for entire winters. Records are incomplete. Memory favours what survived, but the pattern is clear enough to matter. When cold became relentless and timber scarce, people turned inward toward the ground and trusted it to hold. One final small detail stays with you. Some families filled in their dugouts when they left, smoothing the land as best they could. Not out of shame, but out of habit. The earth had sheltered them. Leaving it settled felt respectful. You step away and do not look back immediately. The dugout disappears quickly into the landscape. Grass and soil reclaim its edges. Then a pieces or two. Nothing obvious will remain. What stays is what you carry. The patience learned through slow warmth. The attentiveness shaped by quiet sound. The comfort found in repetition. These things do not vanish when you move above ground. They settle into how you live. Now as the season turns fully and the world opens again, you feel ready in a way you did not before. Not hardened, not triumphant, just steady. And with that steadiness, you let the memory of underground winters soften and fade, knowing it will return when needed, like warmth held deep in the earth. Now everything begins to slow. The story loosens its grip the way winter loosens when it has done all it can. You no longer need to picture walls or feel the weight above you. Those images have done their work. They can rest now. You notice your breathing again, steady and unhurried. The quiet you practiced underground follows you here, smoothing the edges of thought. Nothing needs your attention anymore. Nothing is waiting to be fixed or adjusted. Imagine the earth settling back into stillness, no pressure, no effort, just balance. Warmth held gently, cold kept at a distance. If your eyes are still open, let them close now. If they are already closed, let them stay that way. You have travelled far enough for tonight. The past drifts away. The ground releases its hold. Sleep arrives the way it always should, slowly, without demand. You're safe, you're resting, everything can wait until morning. Sweet dreams.